Hey guys, I've created this video for you just to make things a little bit easier and a little bit more individual with your study. We could do this as a whole class, but sometimes I feel that can take up a lot of unnecessary time. It also means that I'm talking for the majority of the class, and I'd much prefer for you to be working on your assessments or working on your coursework during class time so that you can ask for help when needed, not just from me, but from your peers as well. So I'm going to go through some of the historical context of 1984. This particularly pertains to the criteria of understanding the text. So you must know the historical context of 1984. I highly recommend that you pay attention. All right, so 1984 was written by George Orwell. It was published in 1949. So 1949 to 1984, that's about 35 years. What was happening in the world at this time? I know that you guys have done studies last year on World War II, so I assume that you already have some prior knowledge as to what was going on in Europe at that time. There is a huge amount more going on than just Germany and Hitler. But of course, that's something that you can go on to study in history. It's good though to have an understanding. It wasn't just one fascist ruler that was in power in the early 20th century. In fact, totalitarian regimes were pretty popular in the early 20th century, not just a German idea. So out of these four pictures, I assume you recognize at least one of them, Adolf Hitler, leader of the Nazi Party from 1933 to 1945. We've also got Joseph Stalin, so he was the leader of the Communist Party in Russia. Benito Mussolini, I don't know if you've heard of him. He was the fascist leader of Italy at the time of World War II. He allied Italy with Hitler. Didn't work out so well for him. And then we've also got Francisco Franco, who was his reign began in a very totalitarian way. So he ruled very much with an iron fist for much of the early 20th to mid 20th century. But then he actually kind of eased up, became more democratic in his approach to leading. Not that makes him okay, but it did sort of change over time, and he ended up ruling till 1975, till his death. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of this historical context, what was happening at the time politically, just so you can understand why George Orwell published this book, why he believed the future looked so bleak for society, and why he thought society needed this warning in the form of his book. So political upheaval occurred on a huge scale in the early 20th century. In 1945, the two greatest wars the world has ever fought had only just ended. However, the concept of totalitarianism was still extremely vivid to all people who lived in Europe. So Spain, Germany, Italy, and Russia all ruled by despots. So despots is just another word for a fascist leader. This dangerous political ideology was now also being combined with innovative technology, the combination of which is featured in 1984. People watched in their own homes in 1984, streets, work, constantly because of technology. So George Orwell set his book 35 years into his future, which highlights exactly how bad he believed the political landscape to be in his day. And why wouldn't you think that? I mean, you and I have grown up in a time of relative peace, so definitely not peace all over the world, but in Australia, absolutely. Since we've been born, there really hasn't been anything impacting us on a huge scale like a world war. But for George Orwell, he knew more of war than he knew of peace. And dystopian realities for him, such as the world of 1984, would seem very plausible. He was actually a BBC correspondent in Spain when Francisco Franco came to power. And so he saw that rise, and he actually supported Francisco Franco for the very beginning, thinking that this was going to really change for the people of Spain, things were going to get better. And then of course, as what happens with most totalitarian rulers, I mean, they don't normally come into their political campaign saying, I want absolute power over you and I'm going to take away all your freedoms. They usually come in promising a lot and then restricting freedoms afterwards, and that's what Franco did. So Orwell was understandably jaded by what had happened, and clearly that has impacted a lot of what he's written. So one thing I really want to highlight to you guys is the idea of left and right in Europe. So we think about politics today in the concept of left and right, which I have to say is an extremely broad brush. And I would really recommend to you guys, if you're ever having a political conversation, make sure you don't just pigeonhole someone into left or right, because I personally find that to be really small-minded. I don't think that it really highlights what each of us think about the world. So be really careful in conversations, but of course also with essay writing too. So I'm going to talk a little bit about political ideas in the early 20th century and how they differ from our understanding of left and right today. So many people in the West were unsure how to feel about different political factions. The concept of totalitarianism isn't something that you can attribute to just left or right, but people so often do that. Try to consider in Europe that they had a very different idea. Actually, they have a very different concept of left and right than what we do. So when we read about the history of politics, we need to be careful not to misinterpret information. For instance, Hitler was not what we typically understand to be right-wing, even though a lot of people say that he was. Just as Stalin was not what we would typically understand to be left-wing, even though, again, a lot of people believe that he was. Stalin promoted communism, which is often associated with left-wing politics, which is fairly correct. Left-wing politics usually deal with power to the people, so making sure, equal outcomes for everyone. And Hitler promoted nationalism. And again, nationalism is an idea that is generally associated with right-wing politics, which is sort of love your country. Another linked idea would be patriotism. Nationalism is a little bit different. And taken to extremes, obviously not something that anyone would want. But right-wing politics generally look at, so if we think of left-wing politics as promoting equality of outcome, so making sure everyone ends up with the same, right-wing politics would focus more on equal opportunity. So equal opportunity is making sure everyone starts off with the same opportunity. Now, of course, if you're combining that right-wing idea with nationalism, then you're probably just thinking in terms of people that live in your country, not necessarily thinking outside of it, but that again is a generalization. So I hope that makes a bit of sense. If you're not sure, please come and talk to me, because it is hard for me to just have this conversation with myself in a presentation. If you want to clarify anything, please come and talk to me. The ideas of communism and nationalism are not in themselves horribly bad, like the political landscape that these two leaders created, Hitler and Stalin, but they both have the potential to be. Neither side of politics advocate for the suppression of people or racial superiority. However, both sides of politics are susceptible to turning into what Orwell is warning us against, which is fascist totalitarian governance. This is what both Hitler and Stalin ended up doing. So even though one is more often associated with left and one is more often associated with right, they essentially became the exact same thing, fascist totalitarian rulers. So Orwell is warning us against a future, not against a particular side of politics, but against the repercussions of pushing these ideas to their extremities. I really think that's an important phrase for you guys to remember. Orwell is warning us against a future, not a particular side of politics. And I really recommend that I assume that you're going to discuss politics in some context, or at least forms of governance in your essay, in your analytical essay. However, I would really recommend don't conclude your essay by saying Orwell is warning us against, left-wing communism or right-wing nationalism. To me, I don't think that's appropriate, because I really believe that he is warning us against a future that could happen with any side of politics, not just one. We can talk about that individually if you are unsure about what I mean, or if you take issue with me saying not to conclude with that. So, this book is not intended to be an enjoyable narrative to read and forget. It's important for you to know why it was written and make connections between what occurs in the book and what the author himself knew of the world and experienced. If you can do that, you're going to make your analysis much richer. If you can understand this book as a warning to society, you may also be able to make connections between what Orwell thought the future might look like and what our world looks like today. So some questions you might want to ask yourself is, has Orwell's warnings come to fruition or come to pass? Remembering that Orwell wrote the book in 1949, so if I was you, I would be looking at what occurred in the world between 1949 to 1984, and perhaps there are some connections with, real world progression that you can make with the dystopian future that we see in 1984. So there's a couple that I want to point out to you, and this is something you can look into a bit further. You might even be able to identify some different connections as well. So first one, TVs in every room, the telescreens. So in 1984, there are large TVs that can be seen that were sent into all corners of every house. They're located in homes, in public spaces, used to transmit messages from the party and monitor civilian activity. Telescreens can identify people. They notice when their facial expressions change, and they notice whether their heart or breathing gets faster. Now, in 2020, facial recognition software is developing at an unprecedented rate. In China, 500,000 members of a Muslim minority are being tracked by facial recognition cameras. Chinese startups have built algorithms for the government to track these people with terrifying accuracy. Facial recognition can be used to make tasks automated, convenient, and efficient. But critics argue that there needs to be regulation. So if you think about it, if any of you guys have a new phone with facial recognition on it, then you are actually utilizing that technology. That information is being taken by a device. And I don't know about you, but I've never read the terms and conditions of Apple or any of the other sites that I sign up for. I hope that you all do. I have never done that. But who's to say that they don't have that information? Who's to say that a copy of your face is not in someone else's database being used for whatever they want, because they own that information? Who knows? Another thing that is really that we can make a connection with is never-ending wars with faceless enemies. So with this one here, I wanted to just highlight that we're currently at war. In a sense, we've got officers stationed in the Middle East. We've got allies, so America, UK. Like we're fighting these sort of enemies, but I'll be perfectly honest with you, I don't even know who we're fighting. And perhaps I should be more up to date on world politics. But for me, it's sort of this faceless enemy, and the information that I get is all from newspapers. It's all from media. So if we think about what happens with media in 1984, it's heavily regulated. So imagine if that was happening in our world today. I mean, all I know is what the newspaper tells me. What if that's a lie? How would I know? I won't know, because it's just, we have this faceless enemy in a war, and I don't even know when that's going to end. I really don't know much about it. So thinking from my own perspective, I can see a similarity between that and the way that Winston feels about the wars that are occurring against East Asia and Eurasia. These are areas of the world he's never been to, he knows nothing about, and he knows that news is manufactured. He works in a place that manufactures the news. Scary thought, but an interesting connection. Now, in the book, there is the machine, the Versificator, which creates art, music, and literature, which is artificial intelligence. It's not a person, but it creates that artificial intelligence. So in 1984, Orwell describes how musical propaganda was composed without any human intervention, without on an instrument known as a versificator. So I wanted to tell you guys about something that I read that I thought was really interesting. In March 2017, an author sent his laptop in a car from New York to New Orleans in homage to Jack Kerouac's On the Road. I don't know if anyone's read On the Road. It's a great book, but basically it's about a road trip around America. On the laptop, artificial intelligence software used a camera, GPS, microphone, and a clock attached to the car to record information, process it, and translate it into a novel based on its own terms, which it did. The last one, so we've also got propaganda. I'm not going to talk too much about that because I am running out of time. The last one I want to talk about is regulated sex. So regulated sex is discussed often by Winston in 1984. He talks about his relationship with his wife and the perverted approach to sex that she has as an act of loyalty to the party. Now, of course, China's one-child policy is not the same as the way sex is regulated in 1984, but it still shows how that particular intimate act can be regulated by a dictatorship to control a country's population. So I'm running out of time. We've only got about 15 minutes on this video, but I wanted to give you guys that information before you look at the context of 1984 and start delving into this a little bit more. I just can't reiterate enough how important historical context is for textual analysis. I'll get you guys to complete your task, Context for 1984, which is due on Tuesday next week. Any questions, let me know.